As always, thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sending me this free preview deck. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's video has us going through the Dungeons of Death Precon for Magic the Gathering Dungeons & Dragons Adventure in the Forgotten Realms EDH deck, which is a bit of a mouthful. The way that this video is going to work is I'm going to reveal the brand new cards, probably talk about what they could be good with or in, and then discuss the reprints. I've also decided to do away with the face cam because let's face it, we're here for the cards. If you follow me on Twitter, you already know that the face card for Dungeons of Death is Sephrith of the Hidden Ways. This is the only commander of the four that actually cares about dungeons and has a venture trigger built into it. At 3 mana, I think it's a great costed commander, and it's kind of like an Esper Reanimator at the same time. The first ability has a built-in clause that only triggers once per turn, which is probably so people can't go infinite. Off the top of my head, a mechanic like Dredge or a card like Mesmeric Orb could do a lot of work in this deck. Sure, you only trigger it once on your turn, but basically it's a free way of doing so, since Sephrith doesn't care how the creature card went into the graveyard, just that it was put there. If you're looking for a fair way to trigger this ability once on everyone's turn, a card like Tortured Existence is going to go a long way in your deck. It requires you to have a creature card in your hand and graveyard, and it has an activation cost of 1 black, but the versatility of being able to do it on other people's turns shouldn't be overlooked. Sephrith's second ability, Create Undead, is a reanimation trigger, and not to be overlooked, but I think a lot of people when building this deck will be focused more on the venture and less on the reanimation, but it's cool to have. One thing to note about Sephrith is that the first ability unfortunately also doesn't trigger from token cards, it specifically has to be a creature card, which is a bit of a bummer. My guess is they felt that it would be too easy with a card like Ophiomancer, basically giving you a token on everyone else's turn, and then to be able to sacrifice it to something like Ashnod's Altar, which most decks run anyway, and basically having a guaranteed way of venturing on everyone else's turn. Moving on to the next legendary, Hama Pashar Ruinseeker is another wonderfully costed 3-drop, who cares about dungeons as well. Their ability allows you to trigger your dungeon rooms an additional time, which makes perfect sense to include in a dungeon-based deck. To summarize, this means that if you decide to venture into the Lost Mine of Phandelver, when you go to the cave entrance and scry once, you actually get to scry once again. I don't think this card will be particularly overpowered, but whenever you're getting something, getting 2 of it is typically better. The third legendary, and once more, another 3-drop, is Min, the Wily Illusionist. Her first ability is fairly alright, which is whenever you draw your second card each turn, you get to create a 1/1 blue illusion token, which has the ability of getting +1/+0 for each other illusion you control. Notably, these illusions also don't have that typical clause, which is whenever they're targeted by a spell or an ability, they have to be sacrificed, so these ones get to stick around for a little while. Her second ability is where things get a little bit nutty. It reads, whenever an illusion you control dies, you may put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to that creature's power from your hand onto the battlefield. First of all, it's a permanent, so that could be a planeswalker, that could be a land, that could be an artifact, that could be an enchantment, that could be anything. That is nuts. Secondly, there are so many good cards that are also illusions, like Orvar just right off the bat. That means at least you'll be able to put a 3 converted mana cost or less permanent onto the field, which is just awesome. I guess the idea behind this is basically to give you even more value as you venture into the dungeons and draw cards, since you'll draw during your draw step, and then potentially draw another card as you venture deeper in. We also have Nyalor, who's the only legendary creature in this deck that costs more than 3. Its ability is a bit of a mouthful, and took me a couple times of reading it, and I'm still not sure I entirely understand it. Basically, for each opponent you have, which typically is 3, you get to tap one of your untapped creatures. When you do, you get to gain control of target creature that player controls with power less than or equal to the tapped creature's power for as long as you control Nyalor. Now, I'm not a judge, so I'd probably ask for an official ruling, but I think this means you get to steal up to 3 creatures from your opponents as it comes in, provided you have the creatures to tap for it. Once that's done, you even have the added bonus of his second ability, which is whenever you attack with a creature an opponent owns, not controls mind you, that's a different thing, you gain 2 life, and that opponent loses 2 life. That means if I steal Timmy's Raging Goblin, if I swing at John, that means Timmy's still losing 2, and I'm gaining 2, and John might take the hit from my Goblin anyway. You'll have to keep track of whose creatures is whose, but since paper magic seems to be happening more and more nowadays, that'll be a lot easier than doing it through Discord. The next new card is not a legendary, but in fact a sorcery, and it's Arcane Endeavor. For 7 mana it's a pretty steep cost, and there's a certain element of randomness to it, but I think the upside could be there. You have to roll 2d8s and then choose one of them. You draw equal to that amount. After that's done, you then use the second die that you rolled and get to cast an instant or a sorcery with less than or equal to that result, without paying its mana cost. So in a best case scenario, you're going to draw 8 cards and then potentially cast an instant or a sorcery that costs 8 or less for free. The two main decks that come to mind that would probably want to run this are Mizzix and Melik. Mizzix in the sense that you're able to reduce the cost to probably just double blue, which is fantastic for drawing up to 8 cards plus casting even more free spells, and Melik for being able to cast it off the top of your library and getting a second copy, meaning you can draw up to 16 cards and cast 2 spells, which seems nutty. Next up is Bucknard's Everfull Purse, and it's a fun uncommon for the set. In theory, you could potentially earn up to 4 mana for your 1, but the downside is you have to give away the purse to the player on your right. I guess they're moving away from the type of effect like Humble Defector, where you're able to choose who you give it to, and you're basically able to play keep away from some other players, so this has probably helped justify being able to share the thing around. I will say that this seems like a great addition for my Zedru deck, and I'm curious to test it out, since that deck often wants a lot of mana, plus it gives itself away, which works into Zedru's triggered ability on the upkeep. Next up is a Clay Golem, which once more involves rolling a die. This time it's a D8, and it has Monstrosity, which we haven't really seen since Theros. It can potentially get very large, and its triggered ability of when it becomes monstrous of destroying a permanent isn't bad for a colorless card. The activation cost to roll is a bit expensive though at 6, and I'm not entirely sure what deck would want this. Component Pouch is another new mana rock for the deck. It's highly variable in the sense that you have to roll to see whether or not you get 1 or 2 charges, and if you tap it to roll, you can't tap it for mana. But the next turn, you're able to tap it for 2 mana of different colors, which could be very good. I could see this doing some work in something like Atraxa, because you're able to proliferate the counter on it, and basically never have to worry about rolling for it again. Trudging along with more mana rocks, we have Dungeon Map for 3. It taps for a colorless, which is not bad, and it does have the fun activated ability of venturing into the dungeon for only 3. Unfortunately, it has a clause of only being at sorcery speed, which potentially with Sephirus can cut the amount of time you need to spend in a dungeon in half. The next card has some of my favorite art since I do love me some Illithids, and I can definitely see Jeremy Knoll sticking this into his X tribal deck. It's Extract Brain. For X, a blue and a black, you get to look at target opponent's hand and choose X cards from that hand. You then get to cast their best spell without paying its mana cost, so that's pretty sweet. Unfortunately, if they only have lands, that's not so great. I wouldn't call this the next Villainous Wealth or Torment of Hailfire, but it seems like it has potential when you know your opponents have some sweet cards in their hand. Next up, because we're working alphabetically through these, except for the legendaries, is Grave Endeavor. Part of the Endeavor line, Grave Endeavor is another 7 mana cost, but this time it's instant as opposed to sorcery. You have to roll 2d10s, and once again choose one result and then use the other for the other effect. The first effect is bringing a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the result. That could be huge depending on the creature you bring back. The second effect is by no means bad, as it has each of your opponents losing that much life, while you gain that much life, where X is the other result. While clearly not as overpowered as something like a Grey Merchant of Asphodel, why not double up by bringing a Grey Merchant back and then draining them with it, and then with the spell, for a saucy, life-draining 1-2 punch. The next card we have is something I've used in Dungeons & Dragons before, to very funny effects like blocking doors and causing people to not be able to chase after us. It's an immovable rod. It only costs 1 white to cast, but it does have a bit of a steep activation cost. It does have the benefit of being able to lock out any permanent, so this means planeswalkers, lands, creatures, artifacts, anything that's giving you problems. It's not a problem anymore. It also has one of those fun clauses where you're able to leave it tapped if you want to, and as an added bonus, when you untap it, you get to venture into a dungeon for free, which isn't bad. Next up is another creature for the deck, which is a Midnight Pathlighter. For 4 mana you get a 2/3, which seems to be a very common power-toughness ratio in this deck, and it gives all of your creatures the ability to not be blocked, except by legendary creatures, which is some pretty decent evasion considering people often swarm the board with tokens, and this will allow you to get through. Its second ability has you venturing if a creature connects, but once more it seems very controlled, since you can only do it once regardless of whether 1 or more creatures deal combat damage that turn. I guess this is probably to just help slow people down and not be able to plow through dungeons every turn. I could definitely see a deck like Geist of St. Traft valuing this card, since that's one of the main things you don't want to do, which is swing the Geist into a creature and just have it die. Next up we have Pseudo Removal in a Minimus Containment. This is a fun aura, and probably something I'll consider running in Zedru, and this is a great way to deal with a troublesome permanent, since it basically gives your opponents one choice, and that's either keep it on the field, or sacrifice it because it's a treasure, and have it go to your graveyard. This doesn't do as good of a job dealing with commanders as say a Darksteel Mutation would, but it could be something to consider adding to your arsenal. The next card I have is a Phantom Steed, and it's got Flash for 4 mana, and its Enter the Battlefield effect forces you to exile a creature you control until it leaves, which is a bit so-so, but I guess it's pseudo-protection. There's upside to exiling that creature though, since whenever the Steed attacks, you get to create a tapped and attacking token copy of that exiled creature. Except, guess what? It's an illusion! You also get to sacrifice that token at the end of combat, once more, feeding into Min's ability. I think the design on this card is pretty fantastic, since the first ability can be used to save your creature since it has Flash, so you can do it in response to removal, and the second ability is fantastic for creatures that enter the battlefield effects. Could you imagine exiling an Avenger of Zendikar, and then getting one every time you attack with the Steed? Love it. We have yet another new creature, a Radiant Solar, for 6 mana. It's an angel, so typically it has flying and lifelink, and sure enough it does. It does have 2 fun abilities, with the first being an ETB. Whenever it sees a non-token creature come in, you get to venture into the dungeon, which seems simple enough. There's also no clause that you can only do this once per turn, so if you have a lot of cheap mana dorks, you can go deeper and deeper, if not finish the dungeon in one go. The second ability is basically just having it in your hand, and paying 1 white to discard it. It's a straightforward ability, gaining you a bit of life, and moving you further, if not finishing a dungeon. I like it a lot. The next card on the list is probably my favorite one from the deck, and it is absolutely insane. It is Revivify, and it only costs 2 colorless and 1 white. Basically, this is an instant speed board wipe recovery spell. You roll a d20 first off, and you add that number to the number of creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. If you have a total of anything between 1 and 4 between the d20 and the number of creatures that died, you get to return all those creature cards to your hand. However, if that number equals to 15 or higher, you get to put them all back onto the battlefield. Now, unfortunately, creature card is not the same as a token, and that will not work towards the total count. But I've been in enough EDH games where people have pretty beefy board states, so it really wouldn't surprise me if hitting 15 plus wouldn't be that hard for some decks that go wide. This is definitely something I would consider running in my Carador deck as a way to recover from a board wipe that either I cast or my opponent does. We're getting close to the end of new cards, but one of those new ones is a Rod of Absorption. It's another 3 mana artifact, and it has a really interesting clause, which is that whenever a player casts an instant or a sorcery, you exile it instead of putting it to the graveyard. So right off the bat, this can hurt your opponents who run a lot of blue, since they're not able to flash back those counter spells or draw spells they love to do. You also have the added benefit of being able to activate the Rod and sacrifice it by paying X, and then casting any number of those spells exiled, with a total mana value of X or less without paying their cost. I am not a particularly good blue player, but I feel like this card could just be a great hate bear card by itself just sitting on the board, and just messing with other Spellslinger decks. And then for whatever reason, if later on in the game you find yourself needing a counterspell, a draw spell, both, you can dump whatever mana you need into this, sacrifice it, and voila, you've got exactly what you need. My next card harkens back a little bit to Modern Horizons 2, with the card Search the Premises. Much like Search, Thorough Investigation is another white mana enchantment, which investigates, but slightly differently. Thorough Investigation triggers when you attack, making you 1 token. You won't get as many clue tokens as Search, because obviously you don't have 3 opponents who are potentially attacking you, but at the same time, I'd rather not have to get attacked to make a clue token, to then draw a card. I could see this being a pretty welcome addition to anything that's Voltron based or likes to attack. Zergo Helm Smasher, Aurelia, basically any white deck that likes to attack at least once per turn is going to get at least an artifact that helps them draw a card. This can work well with a Cranial Plating, or, at the very least, just help you draw a card if there's a board wipe to help you get back in the game. The second ability, which is whenever you sacrifice a clue, has you venturing into a dungeon, is just even more added value since it's icing on the cake because you're going to want to draw anyway. The last new card for the deck is the Wand of Orcus, which is giving me some serious He-Man vibes, but that could be because I just watched the trailer for the new series. It's a bit of an expensive legendary equipment since it costs 3 to cast and then 3 to equip, but I could see it easily slotting into the Scarab God, Grimgrin, or even Gisang Geralf. It's got the triggered ability of whenever the creature attacks or blocks, it and any zombie you control gains Death Touch until the end of turn. What's nice is the creature that it's equipped to doesn't have to be a zombie for this to work. And since opponents are less likely to want to block things with Death Touch, whenever the equipped creature deals damage to a player, you get to create that many 2/2 black zombie creatures. That means if you slap this onto the Scarab God and were able to connect, you'd make 5 more zombies, which the Scarab God would be very happy about during your next upkeep. That's all the new cards for the deck. As for reprints, we have some pretty decent ones with things like Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and what precon would be complete without a Sunblast Angel, Sun Titan, and Karmic Guide in white. Notable inclusions though, however, and the ones that I'd like to point out, are Baleful Strix, Hostage Taker, and Phantasmal Image. These are some of my favorite creatures to play with, so it's great to have more copies hitting the wild. As far as lands, of course we're going to have the typical Enter the Battlefield tapped ones, as well as things like Exotic Orchard, High Market, and Darkwater Catacombs. What I think is relatively new to precons, however, are the Shadow over Innistrad lands Port Town and a Choked Estuary. As for the artifacts, there's going to be your typical Soul Ring, and it's nice to see Arcane Signet now becoming a staple to any kind of precon. And I'm happy to say, if you know Commander's Quarters, Wayfarer's Bauble is being reprinted, so that'll hopefully make him happy. As for the remainder of the non-creature spell reprints, you don't have a ton. There's only 5 instants, 3 sorceries, and 1 enchantment, which I've listed here. Anyway gang, this was a bit longer than the last one, so hopefully people enjoyed the bit more of a deep dive into this deck. Let me know what you think of it, and also what deck you're planning to pick up, and if you've had a chance to play with them. I'm really hoping to play and record a game of just the precon decks, so be sure to look forward to that in the future.